Like most treaties, the WTO Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures regulates behavior by states. Now, this is logical because the focus of the Subsidies Agreement is, in fact, on trade effects arising from government interventions that distort commercial markets. Now, the specific language in the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures that regulates this issue of attribution is found in Article 1 of the agreement. Under Article 1, only measures in the form of financial contributions can give rise to subsidies. And as a general matter, a financial contribution may give rise to a subsidy only if it's provided by, and I quote, a government or any public body within the territory of a member. Now, I say as a general matter because there is a provision in Article 1 which you could refer to roughly as an anti-circumvention provision, which says that a financial contribution can also give rise to a subsidy if it's provided by a private body that is entrusted or directed to do so by the government. Now, usually, there's not much question about whether an entity is a government or a public body within the territory of a member. In a traditional case, the classic case, the entity in question might be a government ministry, the Ministry of the Treasury. The Ministry of Science might be giving grants for research and development projects. The Ministry of Agriculture might be providing some type of a subsidy for an agricultural product. Those types of cases are usually clear. There's no question of government's involved. In addition, the agreement regulates behavior not only by national governments, but also by other governments within the territory of a member. So the subsidy might be provided by a state government or a provincial government, or even, in fact, a municipal government, a county government. And in these cases, again, usually the situation is quite clear. Finally, you have a variety of government entities who are sort of clearly and explicitly tasked with performing some kind of public policy function. For example, you might have an export credit agency, which is created by an act of Congress or an act of Parliament that is assigned with certain functions, which is completely owned by the state, and whether that's a public body is usually not a question in dispute. Or you might have a development bank, a regional development bank, also created by the legislature with specific tasks assigned to it of a public policy nature. And again, usually the question as to whether there's a public body is not going to be in question. But there are situations where the question of attribution to the state can be less clear. And one which has come up relatively recently is the question of state-owned commercial enterprises. This issue emerged in a dispute that came before the WTO last year, that is 2010, I guess, that was called U.S. Definitive Anti-Dumping and Countervailing Duties on Certain Products from China. That's DS 379 if you want to look it up. Now, what are the facts in this case? First of all, the measure in question was a countervailing measure imposed by the United States on imports from China. In that case, the Department of Commerce, which is the investigating authority in anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations in the United States, the Department of Commerce treated the provision of certain inputs by majority government-owned state enterprises as the provision of a good or service, that is, as a financial contribution. So concretely, if you imagine the producer, the exporter is a producer of rubber products or tire products, and I actually don't remember the products in question in this case, but concretely, if you imagine you have a producer of rubber products that has to purchase certain inputs, and it purchases those inputs from a state-owned enterprise, but which is a commercial enterprise. Or in addition, the other aspect of the case related to state-owned commercial banks. And here you had, again, the producer-exporter, say, of the rubber or the tire product, and that company received loans from a state-owned commercial bank. So the question in front of the Department of Commerce, and ultimately the question in front of the dispute settlement panel was, were these financial contributions, that is the provision of the goods that are being used by the downstream producer, or the provision of the loans by the government, were these financial contributions by a government or a public body within the territory of the member. Now, the Department of Commerce said in both cases yes, that the state-owned enterprises and the state-owned commercial banks were public bodies. And it was this issue which China appealed to the WTO dispute settlement system. Now, what was the answer? The answer at the panel level was that the concept of a public body within the meaning of Article 1 of the Subsidies Agreement is an entity which is controlled by the government. So the panel focused on the idea of control. And the panel reasoned that where you have control, this gives rise to a possibility that the entity in question might act for public policy purposes rather than out of commercial interest. The panel further said that majority government ownership, although not necessarily conclusive, was clear and highly indicative evidence of control. And on this basis, it found that the Department of Commerce had not erred in treating these government-owned, state-owned enterprises and commercial banks as public bodies. The appellate body, however, disagreed. The appellate body said that government control is not enough to establish that an entity is a public body. The appellate body explained that a public body must possess, and here I'm quoting, it must possess, exercise, or be vested with government authority. And it went on to explain that mere formal links between the government and the entity, such as majority ownership, are unlikely to suffice. Now, what does this mean in practice? Let's look at how the appellate body applied this legal test to the facts in question. With respect to the state-owned enterprises, that is, the companies that were providing some kind of industrial inputs to the downstream producers, the appellate body found that the Department of Commerce had erred because it did not properly find that the state-owned enterprises were public bodies precisely because it relied principally on evidence of majority ownership. But with respect to the state-owned commercial banks, the appellate body found that the Department of Commerce did not err. It found the Department of Commerce had not only evidence of majority ownership, but that it had also relied on evidence that these commercial banks were required to carry out their loan activities based upon the needs of the national economy and under the guidance of state industrial policies. And this was based upon various policy statements, legislation creating the bodies, etc. So the conclusion is, if you have a state-owned enterprise, is it a public body? It might be or it might not be. It's not enough to say that it's owned by the state, even majority ownership. Instead, you have to ask whether the state enterprise is vested with government authority. And you can look at things like the legislative basis for the creation of the entities or legislation or regulations governing their behavior as possibly relevant to that. But it's important to remember that even if you find that a state-owned enterprise is not a public body, that does not necessarily mean that its behavior is not attributable to the state. Because as I mentioned, there is sort of an anti-circumvention provision. And if you can demonstrate that the state-owned enterprise or the state-owned commercial bank was entrusted or directed by the government to provide the financial contribution, then the behavior of that entity is still attributable to the state. Thank you very much.